somewhere beneath the farmland of Antioquia, sealed inside concrete chambers that no satellite can detect and no standard radar can penetrate, billions of dollars are still waiting. Not metaphorically, not as an estimate, literally waiting, wrapped in plastic, stacked in bundles, protected by lead-lined walls and waterproof containers. Sitting exactly where they were placed more than 30 years ago by the most destructive criminal operation the modern world has ever produced, Pablo Escobar died on a Medellín rooftop in December 1993. The Colombian government celebrated, the DIA declared victory, and the official accounting of what he had hidden began. It has never come close to finishing. Every credible estimate suggests that Colombian and American authorities have recovered less than 10% of what was actually concealed. The other 90% has not disappeared. It is simply still buried. But here is the detail that changes everything you think you know about this story. When investigators finally opened some of those vaults, the money was not the most significant thing they found inside. What was sitting alongside the cash, preserved in waterproof containers, written in careful handwriting, organized the way a legitimate business organizes its financial records, was something far more dangerous than currency. This is the full story of Escobar's hidden empire, and it starts with a teenager stealing tombstones. The education of a criminal mind, Pablo Escobar did not arrive at power through inheritance or political connection. He constructed it methodically, beginning with crimes so small they barely registered, and escalating with a consistency that, in retrospect, reads as a kind of dark curriculum. In the late 1960s, as a teenager in the streets around Medellín, Escobar's first documented operation was the theft of grave markers from cemeteries across the Antioquia region. He would remove the stones, sandblast the inscriptions clean, and resell them to grieving families who had no idea what they were purchasing. The scheme required almost no capital, generated modest profit, and demanded a specific psychological capacity, the complete absence of emotional engagement with the harm being caused to others. People who knew him during that period later described a young man who had already separated cause from consequence in a way that most human beings never develop and would not want to. He was not cruel in any theatrical sense. He was simply indifferent in a way that made cruelty efficient. The crimes escalated in a pattern that Colombian law enforcement historians have since studied closely as a model of how criminal careers develop. Car theft followed the grave markers. Extortions followed the theft. Kidnapping followed the extortion. In 1971, his group abducted Medellín businessman Diego Echevarria, collected a ransom equivalent to $50,000, and then executed the victim regardless. The killing was a communication, a signal sent to every corner of Colombia's underworld about the terms on which this particular operator worked. What transformed Escobar from a dangerous regional criminal into something categorically different was a product and a moment in history that arrived simultaneously. Cocaine was beginning to flow toward the United States in the mid-1970s along routes that were still poorly organized, through distribution networks that were fragile and contested. The American market for the drug was expanding at a pace that the existing supply infrastructure could not match. Escobar recognized this gap with a clarity that most people operating in the same environment entirely failed to see. In 1976, he was arrested transporting nearly 40 kilograms of cocaine concealed inside a vehicle tire near Medellín. The arrest should have been a career-ending event. Instead, it became the first lesson in a philosophy he would apply for the rest of his life. He bribed his way out of custody. The officers responsible for the arrest were subsequently killed, and from that point forward, Escobar operated according to a principle he articulated so consistently it became a kind of brand: plata o plomo, silver or lead, the bribe or the bullet. There was no negotiation between those two options. The architecture of an empire. By April 1978, Escobar had moved from individual trafficking operations into something structurally different. A meeting on a rural farm outside Medellín brought together mid-level traffickers from across the region. And that gathering is now considered by Colombian law enforcement historians to mark the formal establishment of what the world would come to know as the Medellín Cartel. The scale of what followed remains genuinely difficult to absorb even now. Decades later, at the peak of the cartel's operation, it was generating an estimated $420 million per week in revenue, not per year, per week. Escobar's personal fortune was assessed by various Colombian and American law enforcement agencies at somewhere between $30 and $60 billion in contemporary value. Forbes placed him on its billionaires list in 1987 and kept him there for 7 consecutive years. The cartel controlled an estimated 80% of the world's cocaine supply at its height. with more than 15 tons entering the United States every single day through a logistics network whose operational complexity, according to a DIA assessment conducted after the cartel's collapse, rivaled that of a mid-sized international freight company. The physical expression of that wealth was extraordinary. His estate at Hacienda Naples spread across 7,000 acres and featured a private airstrip, a bullring, artificial lakes, and a personal zoo stocked with African wildlife, including hippopotamuses that, after Escobar's death, established a feral breeding population in the Magdalena River basin that wildlife biologists are still attempting to manage today in Medellín. He constructed an 8-story building for his family outfitted with reinforced security systems and a purpose-built panic room. In the Caribbean, a fortified villa with a helicopter pad and bullet-resistant windows served as a secondary base. But the most telling detail about the nature of that wealth was not any single property or possession. It was what happened to the money that could not be spent or laundered fast enough. His brother Roberto, who served as the cartel's chief accountant, later testified that the organization spent approximately $2,500 per month on rubber bands alone, used exclusively to bundle incoming cash. He estimated that nearly 10% of all stored currency, more than $2 billion annually, was lost to rats, mold, flooding, and physical decomposition in the warehouses and underground vaults where it was kept in a single night during a period when Escobar was hiding from Colombian security forces. He burned approximately $2 million in banknotes to keep his daughter warm. The detail is confirmed by multiple independent accounts and was verified by family members after his death. Money had become, in the most literal sense, a consumable material. What number surprises you more, the $420 million per week or the $2 billion lost to rats every year? Drop your answer in the comments. Both figures say something real about the scale this operation reached, and we want to know which one actually lands harder for people. Building the vaults. The practical challenge Escobar faced was one that no financial institution could help him solve. Cash was arriving through his operation at a volume that far exceeded the capacity of any conventional laundering mechanism. Banks could not absorb it at the speed it was being generated, legitimate businesses could not process it, and keeping it in any visible or accessible form made it a target from rival organizations. From the growing number of law enforcement agencies attempting to close around him, and from the network of informants that spread through every level of Colombian society around him, his solution was architectural in scale and paranoid in design. Across Antioquia and extending into other regions of Colombia, Escobar invested in concealment infrastructure that law enforcement would spend decades attempting to fully map. Cartel safe houses were converted into fortified storage facilities, their interior walls hollowed out and packed floor to ceiling with bundled currency. Farms throughout the region concealed sealed barrels buried several meters underground, many containing wrapped stacks of US dollars that were intended to remain untouched for years. The properties were selected for their unremarkability from the outside. They were indistinguishable from any other rural estate or suburban residence in the area. Neighbors frequently had no idea what lay beneath the ground around them. The vault construction itself reflected a sophisticated understanding of the detection technologies available to Colombian and American law enforcement at the time. Walls of exceptional concrete thickness were lined with lead sheeting specifically to defeat early ground-penetrating radar systems. Access points were disguised as storage rooms, utility spaces, or interior architectural features that would not draw attention during a cursory inspection. Steel doors were concealed behind surfaces designed to look structurally ordinary. Most significantly, Escobar used a method of compartmentalized construction that prevented any single individual from possessing a complete understanding of what had been built. Multiple independent construction teams worked on separate sections of the same facility, each team knowing only its own portion of the project. No contractor ever saw the full picture. No single worker could, even under interrogation, describe the complete layout of what they had helped build. The human architecture surrounding the vaults was equally controlled. His accountants understood financial flows but not physical locations. His construction crews built chambers but did not know what would fill them. Only a very small inner circle, primarily family members, ever held complete information about where the money actually was. His brother Roberto later described a system of coded ledgers, recorded in a private notation that only Pablo fully understood, in which vault locations were preserved in a form that would be meaningless to anyone else. When Escobar died on that Medellín rooftop in December 1993, most of those codes died with him. The properties that kept their secrets, the mythology surrounding Escobar's hidden properties, took on a life of its own after his death. Fed by rumors that were often more reliable than anyone in official positions was willing to acknowledge. Underground tunnels connecting estates, reinforced escape passages behind false walls. Chambers built beneath safe houses with purposes that their construction strongly implied, but that investigators were reluctant to formally document. Some of those accounts came from law enforcement sources with documented credibility. Others emerged from the wider culture of fear that Escobar had deliberately cultivated a landscape in which rumor functioned as a security mechanism, keeping potential threats uncertain about what they might encounter. In Miami, the property he had purchased on North Bay Road in Miami Beach became one of the most scrutinized addresses in the city's history after American authorities seized it during the mid-1980s. Investigators operated for years on the conviction that the building's walls concealed hidden safes. In 2016, when new owners undertook a full demolition of the structure, construction workers discovered exactly that: heavy concrete safes embedded in the foundation. One disappeared before forensic teams could reach it, prompting an investigation that was never conclusively resolved. A second was transported under armed escort to a Florida bank. A sealed metal cylinder found beneath the kitchen stove was opened to reveal nothing, though investigators never formally ruled out the possibility that its contents had been removed before the demolition began. The 2009 renovation of Hacienda Naples produced a more complete discovery. Workers breaking through a concrete floor in an outbuilding uncovered a sealed chamber that had remained undisturbed for nearly 2 decades. The contents included currency in quantities that Colombian authorities assessed at approximately $10 million, a portion of which had been partially degraded by moisture over the years it had been sealed underground. In 2020, Escobar's nephew publicly claimed to have recovered $18 million from a Medellín property, guided in his own account by a vision. He described bundles of currency wrapped in plastic alongside personal items, including a gold pen and a manual typewriter. Most of the currency had been significantly damaged by moisture and fungal growth, he acknowledged. This was not the only recovery he had made from Escobar-connected properties, and declined to provide any further detail. The consistent pattern across these discoveries is not the amounts found. It is the amounts that remain unaccounted for. Colombian authorities have officially recovered approximately $75 million in assets connected to Escobar. By the most conservative estimates from forensic accountants who have spent years working on the case, that figure represents less than 10% of what was actually hidden. Think about that ratio for a moment. After 3 decades of active searching, using every available technology and an enormous investment of law enforcement resources from 2 countries, less than 10 cents of every dollar Escobar buried has ever been found. Where do you think the rest of it actually is? The comment section on this one is going to be interesting. Leave your theory below. The hunt that closed around him, Escobar's fall, did not arrive as a sudden reversal. It accumulated over years in layers until the structure that had protected him for 2 decades finally had no foundation left to stand on. The bombing of Avianca Flight 203 in November 1989, ordered by Escobar in a failed attempt to assassinate a political rival, killed 107 people aboard, including 2 American citizens. Their deaths brought Washington directly into the conflict at a level and with a determination that transformed the nature of what was being brought against him. President George H.W. Bush authorized a covert American initiative to assist Colombian forces in dismantling the cartel. An elite signals intelligence unit called Centra Spike was deployed with a specific mission: intercept Escobar's communications, build an acoustic profile from his voice patterns, and eventually triangulate his physical location in real time. Centra Spike had been listening to Escobar for nearly 2 years before he negotiated his controversial surrender in 1991. A deal in which he agreed to serve a maximum of 5 years in exchange for immunity from extradition to the United States. What followed was one of the most remarkable arrangements in the history of criminal justice. Rather than entering a state-controlled facility, Escobar was permitted to construct his own prison on a mountaintop outside Medellín, staffed with guards he personally selected from men loyal to him, and equipped with facilities that included a football pitch, a bar, a jacuzzi, and private dining rooms. From inside what became known as La Catedral, he continued, running cartel operations with an effectiveness that eventually became impossible for the Colombian government to publicly ignore. When authorities finally moved to transfer him to a legitimate facility in July 1992, he had already gone. A section of wall had been deliberately constructed with weakened concrete, designed from the beginning as an exit point. By the time troops entered the compound, Escobar had vanished into the Andes with 9 of his men. What followed was 16 months of one of the most intensive fugitive hunts in history, involving Colombian special forces, American signals intelligence, Delta Force operators working under civilian cover, and a vigilante organization of Escobar's former associates and victims' families called Los Pipes, whose campaign against cartel infrastructure was in the private assessment of DIA personnel, involved arguably the single most effective pressure applied against him during the entire pursuit. The intelligence that closed the final trap came partly from Carlos Later, once among Escobar's most glamorous partners, writing from a US federal prison. Later described Escobar's current habits in operational detail: the rotating safe houses, the brief and irregular bursts of cell phone communication designed to defeat triangulation, and a physical reality that the pursuit teams found useful. Escobar was significantly overweight, physically unfit, and incapable of moving quickly over any meaningful distance. On December 2, 1993, one day after his 44th birthday, Escobar made the call that ended everything. He spoke with his son for an extended period, staying on the line far longer than any reasonable operational security protocol should have permitted. CentraSpike intercepted the call. Triangulation narrowed his location within hours to a residential street in the Los Olivos neighborhood of Medellín, a middle-class district so ordinary that the simplicity of where he had been hiding was, in retrospect, its own kind of statement. The assault lasted less than 3 minutes. 3 rounds struck Escobar during the engagement. 1 in the leg, 1 in the back, 1 through the right ear. He was found motionless on the roof tiles, minutes after the shooting stopped. The question of who fired the fatal shot was never conclusively answered, and that unresolved detail has generated debate that continues today. A forensic re-examination using updated ballistic analysis suggested that the terminal wound showed characteristics inconsistent with a shot fired from any meaningful distance. The barrel of the weapon may have been in direct contact with his skull when it discharged. Whether that weapon was held by a Colombian officer, a member of Los Pipes, or Escobar himself has never been formally established. The official coroner's report denied suicide in a press release issued before the question had been publicly raised by anyone. Several forensic pathologists noted at the time that an unprompted denial of that kind tends to produce exactly the doubt it claims to dispel. What the vaults actually contained, when Colombian authorities and American investigators finally opened the vaults and safe houses connected to Escobar's network in the years following his death, they found what everyone had expected to find: stacked currency in quantities that reflected an operation running at industrial scale, sealed containers, the physical remains of a cash-based empire that had moved more money than most countries generate in a year. What they had not adequately prepared themselves to confront was the documentation. Hidden throughout the vault network in waterproof containers were ledgers, meticulous, handwritten financial records covering shipment schedules, payment structures, and transaction histories stretching across more than a decade and touching locations from Colombia to Miami to Madrid and beyond, lists of bribes organized by recipient, amount, and payment date, the names of politicians, judges, police commanders, and military officers who had been on the cartel's payroll, recorded not by moral category but with the same organizational logic a legitimate business would apply to its vendor relationships, for prosecutors in both Colombia and the United States. These documents were transformative. They confirmed, in the cartel's own handwriting, what investigators had long suspected, but found difficult to establish through conventional evidence. The corruption that enabled the operation was not peripheral to its structure, it was the structure. The bribery network was not a support system for the cartel. It was the cartel's primary operational asset, the mechanism through which every other element of the empire functioned. Former associates and residents of Escobar-connected properties also described interior spaces that never appeared in any official documentation. Soundproofed rooms fitted with drainage infrastructure and metal fixtures serving no architectural purpose that any legitimate construction project would require. Colombian law enforcement historians have treated these accounts with caution, but noted that descriptions collected from multiple independent sources across many years were consistent enough in their specific details to merit serious consideration. The investigators who worked closest to the evidence declined to formally confirm what those spaces had been used for. Their silence on that specific question was, in itself, a kind of answer. The vaults were built to protect Escobar's wealth. What they ultimately preserved was evidence of everything that wealth had cost: in institutional corruption, in systematic violence, In the moral corrosion of an entire society that had been forced to operate inside a structure he imposed on it for nearly 2 decades, what remains? Escobar's death did not end what he had created. It simply created a vacancy. The Cali cartel, already organized and operational before the Medellín organization collapsed, moved quickly into the space that opened. Colombia's cocaine export capacity showed barely any decline in the transition period. The violence that had been Escobar's primary instrument became the instrument of whoever came next. And then whoever came after that. What ended on that Medellín rooftop in December 1993 was not the underlying condition that had produced him. What ended was one man's extraordinary personal grip on it. The search for what he buried continues in a form that has changed significantly over the decades since his death. Ground-penetrating radar systems have become far more sophisticated than the technology available to investigators in the 1990s. Drone-mounted scanning equipment can now survey large areas of agricultural land with a resolution that would have been impossible a generation ago. Environmental DNA analysis has begun to offer new methods for detecting disturbed soil in areas where no surface evidence of excavation remains visible. Despite all of that, the fundamental accounting has not changed. Approximately $75 million recovered across 30 years of active investigation, multiple billions still unaccounted for by any credible estimate, sealed chambers beneath properties that have changed ownership multiple times. Their contents unknown to current owners who have no reason to examine the ground beneath their feet. The rats and the mold that Escobar's own accountant described as consuming $2 billion annually are still working on whatever remains. Some of it may already be beyond recovery. Much of it, preserved in the lead-lined and concrete-reinforced chambers that Escobar's construction teams built specifically to resist the passage of time, is almost certainly still intact. The most unsettling conclusion drawn by every serious investigator who has worked on this question over 3 decades is a straightforward one. Most of it is probably still out there. Pablo Escobar started with stolen tombstones in the cemeteries of Antioquia. He ended on a rooftop in a middle-class neighborhood of the city he had once functionally controlled. Shot 3 times, carrying a pistol he had originally surrendered to Colombian authorities 2 years earlier when he walked into his self-constructed prison. Between those 2 moments, he built something so large that its physical remains the concrete, the lead sheeting, the waterproof containers, the coated ledgers are still being discovered today, and will almost certainly continue to be discovered long after everyone alive who knew him is gone. The vaults were his attempt to make his empire permanent, in a way he never intended. They succeeded. Every discovery adds a new layer to the documented record of what was built, what it cost, and how far one person can take an operation that operates entirely outside any constraint legal, moral, or human when the will and the indifference to consequence are both sufficiently developed. That is ultimately what this story is about. Not the money. The money is just the most visible evidence of the thing. What Escobar built was a demonstration of what happens when a particular kind of intelligence is applied without any limiting factor at all. Colombia is still dealing with the consequences. So is the United States. So, in different ways, is every country that the cartel's supply chain touched. The final tally of what is still buried will never be fully known. But the next time someone breaks through a concrete floor in Antioquia and finds something that was not supposed to be there, it will not be a surprise to anyone who has followed this story carefully. Which part of this surprised you most? The scale of what was built, the sophistication of how it was hidden, the documentation that was preserved alongside the cash, or the fact that so little has ever been recovered? Tell us in the comments. This community consistently brings perspectives to these stories that we genuinely do not anticipate, and we read everything you send.